Hello, this is Dr. Eric Bricker with AHealthcareZ, and this is the How to Sell in Healthcare podcast. In today's episode, we will be discussing how to play and win the RFP game. That's right. If you are going to work in healthcare, health insurance, and employee benefits, especially in the large market segment, then you have to understand the request for proposal, i.e. RFP process. Now, I have probably been involved in dozens, probably under 100, so probably not triple digits, but dozens and dozens of RFPs over the years in my 11 years of selling to employers in the employee benefit space. Now, it's important to understand several dynamics of the RFP process. One, let's look at the RFP from the client perspective. Okay, so typically the RFP is a formalized process whereby various vendors will do written and oftentimes associated with in-person presentations for an employer, and that RFP oftentimes involves many, as in like dozens or even hundreds of specific questions about the scope of services and about the company and about contracting, et cetera, that they want to information they want to know about the vendor. Now, for let's say employers over 2,000, there are many employers over 2,000 and many jumbo employers over 30, 40, 50,000 that when they do large employee benefits purchasing decisions, they actually do not go through an RFP process. So it doesn't have to be that way. Now, I would say that probably the majority of employers over that size, especially over 10,000, will go through an RFP process. Additionally, companies that are under 2,000 employees will also go through an RFP process. Okay, there are certain things that are consistent across employers that tend to do the RFP process. One, oftentimes municipalities and school systems, by their sort of bylaws or covenants or what have you, they're required to do an RFP. So oftentimes a municipality might have a fairly low dollar threshold for doing an RFP, like any city or county or state purchasing decision in excess of $50,000 a year must go through a formalized RFP process. There are many municipalities that have that type of rule in place. Likewise for school systems. Also, companies that have been around for a long time, i.e. 20, 30, 40, 50 years, also tend to have an RFP process because they've just been around longer and they've had enough time to develop a more formalized and structured purchasing process for all sorts of purchases, including their purchases of HR and employee benefits services and solutions. Now, the RFP process is helpful from an employer standpoint too, because it allows the employer purchaser to then pit the companies that are bidding against each other, and they will use the RFP process to pit these competing vendors against each other in a number of ways. Number one is price. So oftentimes, if there is a vendor who does not have a chance of ever winning the business, but they are the lowest price provider of XYZ specific services, they will use that vendor and they will keep them in the running all the way down to the very end as a way to force the other vendors to lower their price. Let me give you an example of that. Oftentimes, especially in HR and employee benefits, they will go through an RFP process even though their existing health insurance carrier or benefits consultant offers that service. For example, if there is disease management, case management, healthcare navigation, open enrollment support, employee benefits portal, HR outsourcing, etc., employee onboarding, then oftentimes large employers could buy those services as an upsell from their existing insurance carrier, or there also oftentimes are shared services by, like, Mercer, that they can, buy the HR outsourcing services from them. Now, that is very attractive to an employer because they then don't have an additional vendor that they have to deal with. And in terms of, let's say, going through the sort of IT approval process or the security audit process, then their vendor has already gone through that. They don't need to go through it again. However, that existing insurance carrier might be charging a fairly large amount. In fact, it's fairly well known throughout the employee benefits community that health insurance carriers actually make the majority of their profit off of all of the buy-up add-on options on top of their administrative services only claims processing services. And so those services, as the quote-unquote add-ons by those insurance carriers, might be fairly expensive. And so the employer might have several other vendors in the running that are offering the service for less in an effort to lower, go back to the carrier and say, hey, well, we've got this other vendor who's has a price that's 30% below yours or 50% below yours. And that will force the insurance carrier's hand to have to lower their price. Now, that being said, oftentimes the employer will also have vendors that are in the running for the have vendors participate in the RFP process, and typically it's a whittling down process where they might have one or two rounds of whittling down, where they'll go from like 10 to 5 to 2 to 1, or sometimes they'll go from 5 to 2 to 1. But they'll want to have those other vendor options available for a number of reasons. One is, as I said, as an opportunity to bid folks against each other down on price. Two, as an opportunity to show their management, purchasing department, CFO, etc., that they went through a rigorous process of evaluating the marketplace. So it's almost like a CYA thing, so that when they choose a particular vendor, they can say, look, we went through a very structured RFP process, so that if for whatever reason the vendor doesn't work out well, then they can go back to that structured process and be like, well, look, we went through a structured RFP. It's not like we just willy-nilly chose this vendor as a one-off. They will also want to have other vendors in the running because of particular capabilities that they might have, whether it be technology capabilities or service level agreements capabilities. So just know that you as a salesperson might be involved in an RFP where you are, you progress in the RFP process, even down to the final two, but your probability of actually winning that RFP is actually 0, because the employer actually never intends on choosing you, but they basically use you as a way to get more of what they want out of the sort of preconceived winner that they already have. And oftentimes that preconceived winner is especially in the large group, is the existing carrier or benefit consultant. Okay, fine. Let's take a step back. The key to winning an RFP is to have won the RFP before the RFP is created, and to actually help create the RFP. So at Compass, we won many, many, many RFPs. And I would say in the vast majority of those situations, the employer already was looking at us, had met with us, had multiple meetings with us, had even done some degree of due diligence with us prior to ever going out and doing a formalized RFP process to begin with. And I will add, they would even sometimes ask us to create the RFP for them and structure it in a way so that it would make us look better than everyone else. And of course, we were going to structure the RFP to make us look better than everyone else, but the potential client specifically told us to make the RFP in a way that would make us look better than everybody else. So know that if you are going into the RFP process and you were not involved in creating the RFP because you had already been engaged in sales discussions with the employer prior to RFP creation, then it is highly unlikely that you will win the RFP. Why is this important? it will save you a ton of time and energy rather than chasing every RFP that comes across your company. The amount of time and money that can be spent on RFPs that end up being an exercise in futility is quite large. And so you, for the sake of opportunity costs, right? If you're going to be spending money on an RFP, that's time and money that you're not spending on going after other clients that are going to be much more high likelihood to close. Okay, so from a sales efficiency standpoint, understanding that not being involved prior to the RFP and in the actual RFP creation will often lead to not winning the RFP. Number two, if you are not involved in the RFP creation and involved in sales discussions prior to the RFP, it also helps you better gauge your sales projections. So these often tend to be very large dollar contracts, and so your probability of closing them needs to be exceedingly low. And if you were not involved in the creation of the RFP and you put it at 25% or 50% or 75% likelihood to close, then you are going to totally throw off the sales projections, because that's just not consistent, at least in our experience, with historically what happens. Okay, so it's very important from those two standpoints to understand if you were or were not involved in sales and creation of the RFP. Okay, the next point regarding RFPs is that large employers will actually have their benefits consultant write the RFP for them. And this is actually a revenue opportunity for the benefits consultant. So, and it also, and both the benefits consultant and the employer win when this happens. Let me explain. The benefits consultant sees this as another opportunity for additional revenue. Essentially, running an RFP for an employer is another buy-up or an additional service that employer can buy from that benefits consultant. So the benefits consultant is more than happy to charge them, whether it be per hour, on a project basis, or what have you, to run the RFP. And Compass was involved in many RFPs that were actually run by the consultant, of course, in conjunction with the employer, but it was the consultant that ran the blocking and tackling in terms of formation and bringing in all the RFP requests and then scoring the RFPs and then helping to decide who advances to the next rounds, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this also is in the interest of the employer, so that if the purchase goes south and is a complete failure, it gives the employer then an opportunity to place the blame on somebody other than themselves. And they can say, well, you know what? It was really because XYZ consultant really messed up on the RFP process. And so the employee benefits director or the HR person is going to need to answer to their boss, and their boss is going to say, okay, well, how are we going to make sure that this never happens again? And then the answer needs to be, okay, because we're going to fire our benefits consultant, or we're going to go to our benefits consultant and ask for that person on the benefits consulting team to be removed, or asking for a complete change in personnel on that benefits consulting team. And that's a common consulting strategy, right? Where the employer will hire the consultant so that they have a backup scapegoat as a way to hedging their risk for blame and therefore keeping their own job. Remember, these large company employee benefits job positions are very few and far between. And if they lose their job, they're likely going to have to move to another city in order to find another benefits position. And most people understandably don't want to do that. They don't want to have to uproot their families. We had a good family friend that worked in large corporate HR, really, Fortune 50, Fortune 10 companies his entire career. They moved a lot. That was just kind of the deal for this very large corporate HR exec that he was. So if the benefits people don't want to move, then they want to do everything they can to hedge having to move with the use of the consultant. Okay, so that then brings into why it is good to have a positive working relationship with a consulting firm from an existing client standpoint, an account management standpoint, and you want to make the benefits consultant a winner on all your existing employer clients that are in the large group jumbo market. So we talked before about prospecting and selling to large employers, and we said how it's important to go direct. And I still stand by that. However, it's important to, as you progress down the sales cycle, to when that consulting team from Aon or Towers or Mercer or whomever, when they're going to talk within their own organizations about XYZ vendor involved in the RFP process, and you're going to want to have advocates within those benefits consulting firms say, okay, when Mary in New York City calls Joe in Chicago about his experience with XYZ vendor, you want Joe to tell Mary very positive things about that experience. So even if you're going direct, you still want to make the consultants out to be winners in your relationship on the engagement, such that that's going to engender a smoother RFP process on future business. Now, that's really thinking long term, and for a lot of salespeople, they're not thinking that long term, and that's understandable. And even for account management, they're not necessarily, thinking about that. But just know that that's kind of how it works. And so to be able to have that bigger picture, more longitudinal approach to relationship building within employee benefits consultants, at least at Compass, it ended up bearing fruit for us. Now, when you go through the RFP process with an existing benefits consultant running the RFP and a very large employer, just know that you've got the deck stacked against you again, as I referenced before, because that insurance carrier is likely paying override payments to the benefits consultant. And whether it's implicit or explicit, then there is going to be a financial conflict of interest between the decisions on the RFP and additional monies that are being paid to the benefits consultant by the insurance carrier. Now, that might be fully disclosed depending upon the contractual relationship between the benefits consultant and the employer. I would say the vast majority of time when there is a benefits consultant run RFP, that the majority of the time the insurance carrier will win. And at the end of the day, it's not just because of the money, it's just because of the ease of not having to deal with more vendors. So at the end of the day, if you're an incumbent vendor, or you're an insurance carrier with it already baked in, or you're just a low-cost provider, then that is most likely to win the RFP process, which is why I said in previous episodes of the podcast, that's why going direct is more helpful. And also, too, there are plenty. We had one of the largest fast food chains in America was a client of Compass. And they ran an RFP because they were a long-established company. And they essentially, for these types of purchases, it was just their company's protocol to run an RFP. However, the company itself ran the RFP. They did not have their outside consultant run the RFP. And Compass was involved with that employer prior to the RFP going out. Now, this particular employer did not ask us to help, quote unquote, design their RFP, but we absolutely had multiple meetings and many conversations with them prior to them going into the formalized RFP process. Okay, so the next thing having to do with RFPs is RFP creation, because at the end of the day, you got to get the RFP done. Let's say you've talked to them beforehand, you're in good standing, maybe you even help create the RFP for them. You still need to produce the RFP. The salesperson should not create the RFP, just because, frankly, the RFP creation is probably not the strong suit of the salesperson. So one, it requires gathering a lot of information from across the organization. So it's a little bit of a scavenger hunt. So we had a sales operations, and probably the development of our sales operations organization was really a point of maturity for Compass as an organization. And of course, much larger organizations have large sales operations organizations. These are essentially, I don't want to call them the support staff because I don't want to belittle them. They were incredibly important, but these were folks that did all sorts of tactical and strategic work behind behind the scenes supporting the sales staff. And one of the main things they did was RFP creation. So they had people with excellent writing skills. We had people that had excellent organizational skills. We had them involved in with creative design work, because obviously you got to make the RFP look good. It involved, again, there's just often a lot of very detailed, let's say, IT questions and operational capability questions, which the salesperson doesn't know the answer to. And so they're going to have to go through a scavenger hunt process within the company to actually find those answers. And there's revision after revision after revision. Once the RFP is created, the most important word to put on that RFP is draft, because it's going to have to go through at least 3 or 4 major revisions before it goes out the door. And that has to be, it's basically like a project. It has to be managed as a project. And we would use our own CRM for actually project management of our RFP process, and you would have to manage it like a project, because you would have a whole bunch of different moving parts that you would have to line up and coordinate and put together in this final RFP by a specific deadline. And you would march back X number of days or weeks before that deadline to be like, okay, we have to have the draft by this date so that it can go by a review process in order to go out the door by the due date, before the due date, etc. So the skill associated with RFP creation is it's definitely there. So it's kind of like playing tennis. So you don't necessarily have to hire people that have a ton of experience in RFP creation, but you're going to have to teach them, and they're going to have to learn a lot about RFP creation if they're not already very familiar with the process. And then 2, it's very seasonal. So because the large market, going back to our previous episode about the seasonality, because the large groups are making their budgetary decisions June, July, maybe August at the latest, those RFPs are typically done April, May, June. There's a fair number of groups that do their RFPs are due in June, and then they're going to make their decision just after the 4th of July, and then or they're going to go through the review process just after the 4th of July, and they're going to make their decision by the end of July, beginning of August. I mean, that's a little bit of a pressured time frame, but that still happens quite a bit. So just know that your sort of late springtime is and for your big jumbos, they are doing RFPs in the fall for the plan year 2 years in the future. So they will do the RFP process in the fall of 2020 for the January 1 of 2022 plan year, because they are longer than a 1-year planning cycle for their employee benefits, because they're such a large organization. So just know that so what that means is that your RFP people and your sales support people, you're going to need to be able to flex responsibilities such that you need to give them more and different types of work during other parts of the year. And then you're going to have to flex back those work requirements during the spring, when they're really going to have to double down on spending a ton of time and effort on RFP creation. So I don't want to belabor this topic, because it is, at the end of the day, you can still be highly successful with a minimal of RFPs, okay? Now, does adding a successful RFP process and RFP sales help your sales? Absolutely, which is why we're going over it. But it is not, RFPs are, and skilled RFP execution is necessary, but it's not sufficient. If there's one thing that I would say is the take home is that if you have this awesome process for creating awesome RFPs and you're still not winning sales, just know that's to be expected, because successful RFP creation and execution is necessary, but it is not sufficient. And it's really all of that work prior to the RFP that's really going to set up the RFP for the positive sale and the win. And with that, I bring this episode of the How to Sell in Healthcare podcast to a close. Again, this is Dr. Eric Bricker with AHealthcareZ. Thank you so much for giving me your time and attention, and I wish you the best of luck.